Welcome back. We're again in the studio with Walter and Sonika Fight. We've just learned about your first evangelistic series with Francois Duplessis and all the things that transpired, how much opposition you had. And you were doing this all while you were in debt, weren't you?
Yes.
That's rather an interesting thing to do. Most people would find a second job, but you decided, no, you're going to do God's work.
You must remember that I had been living in error. I was an atheist. I had terrible experiences in my home. Religion had lied to me about what the Bible said. There was no such thing as everlasting torment that God in his wrathful nature would throw someone in. Coming from an atheistic experience, when I read books like Dawkins, The God Delusion, where he hates God with a passion. And I think to myself, but that was me. And I read his books and I see why he hates God, not because of what God says, but because of what theologians say about what God says. I was driven. I had to help people to get over that mindset. God is not what the world says out there. God is worth following, and truth is worth unearthing.
So what happened with your university? You were in university, you were working as a professor while you were doing this evangelism?
Well, how did I become a professor in the first place? That's quite a miracle. I mean, I'm in the zoology department. Zoology departments don't employ creationists. They just don't. You're either an evolutionist and you have that mindset, or you're not a zoologist. So I was merely relieving when I was appointed at the university, and it was a temporary position. And for a while there, I actually went and taught in a temporary position in another university when that temporary post was no longer available. And so at one stage they phoned me and said, there is a lecturership available, which was quite a step down for me. I mean, I was senior lecturer before, now step down. And they said to me, apply, you'll get the position because, you know, you've worked for us now and things work well, and come and apply. So I applied for it, and the professor said, piece of cake. And then finally he phoned me and he said, sorry, not piece of cake, because things had changed in South Africa and we had affirmative action. That meant that I wasn't of the right race to be appointed. So I lived with that, and then the next thing that happened was he phoned me back and he said, on the list you were secundus, that means you were the second, because we first had to give the opportunity to set the record straight in South Africa. But that person declined because the salary was too low. So you're the next in line, would you accept that salary? Well, I had nothing, so any salary was fine. So I said, sure, I'll accept that salary. So I was appointed as lecturer. And being academic all my life, I got involved in research. But my point was, what kind of research was I now going to do? Because my research was purely phylogenetic, it was physiology, but it was based on evolutionary principles, and I wasn't going to do that anymore. Now, fortunately, as a comparative physiologist, you can get involved in any type of research using animals as a model. So I wanted to become involved in research on nutrition and health using animals as a model.
Why did you get interested in that field, nutrition?
Well, it's a long story. When we became Seventh-day Adventists, when we were baptized, we knew nothing about spirit of prophecy. Both of us, we were baptized, knew nothing about. Nobody told us anything about spirit of prophecy. I didn't know what it was. And then one day, while we were still on the farm, there was a colporteur who used to come by between two cities, Port Elizabeth and Cape Town, and we were sort of in between, and he would come by and he'd give us some books, and we had all these funny books, but we didn't know what they were, Ellen G. White and stuff like that, so we just put them down there. One day I got a phone call from an ex-colleague of mine, and he went ballistic because I'd become an Adventist. And he was so irate that I had become part of the sectarian movement. And then eventually he let loose a tirade against Ellen G. White that was second to none, calling her names that I do not want to repeat on television. And I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. If someone's so angry against this person, maybe this person has something interesting to say. And so I went and I looked these books that this colporteur had brought, and one of them was called Desire of Ages. And that's the first one I ever read. And I started reading Desire of Ages, and I was so impressed. This was the most amazing thing I'd ever read, and if anything takes you to the Bible and uplifts Jesus Christ, then it is that book. And of course, even the world says it's the best book that has ever been written on the life of Christ in existence. And I don't think there are hardly any people that are prominent in religious fields that haven't made use of that book to further their depth of knowledge of what pertains to Jesus. But of course, this person also writes on issues of health and other issues. Now, I didn't read any of that stuff yet, none of it. Now, the irony of everything is we had a dairy farm. We had a dairy farm. And my poor wife, unbeknown to her or to me, couldn't handle the dairy at all. She had asthma all her life. You tell that.
I had very bad asthma. I had a pump that I carried with me. And at that stage, while we were on the farm still, suddenly I just one day got terrible earache. When I got to the doctor, the eardrum had burst from infection, and we still didn't know that it had anything to do with what we were eating. And so when we were back in Somerset West, I was going from one doctor to the next, and an internist or nobody could find anything wrong. They couldn't tell me why I still had asthma. And I eventually came to a young doctor, a lady, and she looked at me and she said, "You have allergic asthma. So you're allergic to something that you're eating, and I would suggest it is dairy." And I said, "Dairy? Never. I mean, dairy is good food. You can't live without it. It's got calcium. It's all the good stuff." But she said, "Go home and try. Just stop eating dairy for about 3 months and see what happens." And that's what I did. I went home, and now I had the family against me because now suddenly we were not having milk anymore, no yogurt, no cheese, nothing. And
Me, rebellious?
Very rebellious. Oh. And he was a person who would take a pan after we were baptized already. The Adventists would often invite us for potluck, and he would come there and he would have his steak, huge steak, fried in a pan, and he would go and stick the pan under their nose and say, "This is food, not that rubbish that you're eating." So he was very rebellious in the beginning, and it's actually quite ironical that the Lord used him eventually to do research on health.
But let me just chip in there. We were still on the farm. I was not interested in the health message at all. These Adventists with their funny diets, I used to as she said, make them smell what food is all about. And then one day, totally separate from this, we had guests. And these were ex-colleagues of mine, university colleagues. And they came to visit us. And we did the normal thing that we normally did. We had a huge barbecue. And at that stage, were we still drinking even wine? I don't think so.
No.
We'd given up wine drinking. We weren't drinking alcohol anymore. In fact, we'd thrown away a whole room full of alcohol. We threw it down a septic tank, not realizing that the whole septic tank would then pack up and we'd have to get someone to remove it all. And I still remember the man who came with a truck to remove it. He said, "Never smelled a septic tank like that. Fruity, what's in it?" It was all our alcohol that was in it. But after this, these people arrived and they ate and we had this barbecue. The next morning, both of us at the same time said, "There's something wrong with us. There's something wrong with what we are doing here," but we didn't know why. And then I started reading about health and issues like that, and started reading Spirit of Prophecy, writings on health, and then her story with the milk and the asthma and all of these issues. And then I started making a list. I systematically took the writings of Ellen G. White on health, and I made a long list of improbable things. You shouldn't eat this, you shouldn't eat that, we weren't designed for animal proteins, and the Bible says, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree with fruit on it, and it shall be yours for food." That was the original diet. So that was seeds, grains, nuts, fruits. That was the diet. There were no vegetables, nothing. And then she writes about all of that stuff. And then after transgression, vegetables were added. And vegetables are needed to augment something that is gone. You know, the earth was cursed. After that, after the flood, animal products were added, but with certain prohibitions. No blood, no unclean animals. So I first started off with that, right? My unclean and clean animals. And I thought, well, there must be a difference between the two. Why is this one clean and why is that one unclean? And there's fascinating research that has been done, that when you take extracts of unclean animals and you do experiments with plants and the growing rate of plants, where you add the unclean extract, they're suppressed. The whole plant is suppressed, the growth, so it affects the genetics. And the unclean animals and the clean animals, there are vast differences in the growth rate, so it does affect it. One of the first questions I asked is, well, what's wrong with animal protein? The first thing that comes to mind is, protein is protein. Who cares? You're going to digest it and it's going to end up as amino acids. There can't be any difference between a plant protein and an animal protein. They're both made of the same thing. And then I started doing research on the proteins. And I took all these writings as a guide. And I made a long, long list of all the strange things. And all of a sudden, as a lecturer, I had many students, and they were interested in what I was doing. So I had them do experiments. And I'd say to them, all right, we'll do an experiment. You will have this project, you will have that project. We will compare plant protein versus animal protein on the health status and growth of rats. That animal. And then strange things. Some other scientists came and they said, you know, they have this massive problem of sheep that develop skew legs when they are stall-fed. And why have they got skew legs? They cannot walk, their legs are buckled, there's nothing wrong with their diet. And one person had attended my lecture where I said there's a difference between plant protein and animal protein, because the ratio of amino acids is different. And if you have animal proteins, then there are more sulfur-containing amino acids than there are in plant proteins. And when you have to metabolize them, then you're actually producing sulfates, which will leach out calcium out of the system. And he picked up on this and he said, do you think it's possible that the stall-fed animals get skew legs because we're feeding them animal protein? And I said, absolutely, that's what's happening. And he says, nah, this can't be. But he got intrigued and got involved, and eventually we applied for funding. And the government funding said, we won't fund that. There's no difference between proteins. Plant protein is plant protein and animal protein is animal protein. We will not fund such nonsense. So I went to my university and said, the government doesn't want to fund it. Will you give me a grant? They were reticent, but they gave me a little grant. And this other place, which was a experimental farm, they gave a grant. And so we started our research. Now what they feed stall-fed animals is fish meal together with other things. So we had experiments with animals that didn't have it and animals that did get it, those that were plant-based, those that had different percentages of animal protein, and the results were phenomenal, absolutely amazing. The more animal protein they received, the skewer their legs got. They just deteriorated. And it was statistically absolutely thunderous. And this started getting momentum. And so when these results came out, and I could make a case that there was really a difference between plant protein and animal protein, then the government started funding this research.
This is the Royal Society London grant?
No, not yet. Now, this just basically means that I got more and more students. And then I got very interested in disease and the transfer of disease and why animals would have bacteria which become antibiotic resistant, for example. And why this was becoming an epidemic, antibiotic resistance. And then I suggested that because farm animals are fed antibiotics, pro forma, they're given antibiotics because it improves the growth rate, that this was causing antibiotic resistance. And so I started getting students in that direction, and I had PhD students, and my research just grew exponentially. And then our professor, he got sick, he got cancer, and he died. So now there was a vacancy, a professorial position. And my university, because my research had grown, came to me and said, I must apply for the position. So I applied for the position, and I was the candidate that on paper had, well, the best probability of getting it. So they didn't want to appoint me because some people said, but you know, he doesn't believe in evolution. You can't have a professor in a secular university that doesn't believe in evolution. So they decided to have a search committee to find someone else for this position. And finally they found someone from a top international, non-South African, European university, one of the best, who also had to have other criteria because they wanted to correct gender inequalities and race inequalities and all of those things. So they settled on the gender thing, so they appointed someone else also in that position. It's a long, interesting story, and I'm not going to go into it, but eventually they appointed both of us as professor, and then the one, through very strange circumstances, didn't take up the position, so I was the only professor. So here was a secular university that had appointed someone who didn't believe in evolution. And the conversation, so I gathered afterwards, was something like this. We cannot appoint this man, he's controversial. He doesn't believe in evolution. Yes, but he has the certificates, he has the criteria. And being a post-struggle university, eventually someone said, but controversial is good. We're sick and tired of the status quo. Why not have someone controversial? And that's how I actually got the position. But of course it created opposition from within. You would have opposition. And the students, they would ask me in the classes, why don't you believe in evolution? And I would say to them, I'm sorry, it's not part of the curriculum. The curriculum is evolution. I don't believe it, but that doesn't mean that I can now spend university money and university time to tell you why I don't believe it. But if you're interested, arrange a lecture after hours and I'll tell you. And I did. They would, don't tell a student that, right? So they would arrange lectures after hours and I'd give my lectures. And then they'd sit in the evolution classes and they'd say, sorry, it's not like that, it's like that. And the lecturer would say something and they'd say, it's not like that, it's like that. And of course, what happens? They start getting irritated with us and saying, I'm indoctrinating the students. So there was tremendous antagonism from within. And eventually they would gather enough of so-called evidence against me to make a case against me. And then the university was required to investigate the issue. But something else happened before this that made me almost an untouchable in the university. And sometimes terrible things that happen and trials that come serve a totally different purpose. For example, we had terrible riots in South Africa because of the apartheid issue. And these riots always spilled over onto university campuses. And this was the fermenting ground. And so we would have activists come in from outside and try to dictate issues. And the university was in constant flux. And the whole nation would be inundated with this. And they would close all universities and throw rocks and beat up people and throw petrol bombs. And it was chaotic. It was a very bad situation. And you couldn't drive anywhere you wanted to. And if you drove through some areas, you would be necklaced. Now, you know what a necklace means? When they put a tie around your neck and they pour gasoline into it and set it alight and burn you alive. So it was extremely dangerous. It was even dangerous for me to drive to work. I was shot at 3 times. I had to once dive behind a wall. On the university campus, there was a huge riot and the bullets were whizzing past me. And it was very, very dangerous. I was once involved in a drive-by shooting because there were a new economy was developing and the taxis had to now take over the transport system and transport hundreds of thousands of people, and buses were transporting, so there were wars between taxis and bus companies. And sometimes people in taxis would drive past buses full of people and they would kill everyone. They would just shoot indiscriminately into the buses. And I was involved in one where the bus was in front of me and I was behind it, and the taxi came past and they were shooting with AKs. And they killed the bus driver, and the bus rolled. And chaotic situations, like very dangerous situations. And then there was this riot on the campus, and the university had decided lectures continue, but they didn't know how bad it was going to be. So I said, I was then professor and head of the department, so I said, lectures go ahead, everybody as normal. And then the rolling violence started. What do they call that?
Toy.
Toying, yes, but rolling action, whatever.
Yeah.
I can't remember what they call it. Rolling mass action. That's when they come and they rhythmically come through. And if they found then people in the lectures, they would beat them up. They would hit them with baseball bats, they would smash knees, they would kick the ladies in the faces. They were terrified of this. And before you could do anything, they were in the building. They were coming in the building. And I saw they were coming, and it's thousands. There's nothing you can do. There's no way you can get out. That's it. They're going to come through the building, and they're going to open the lecture halls, and they're going to drag the students out, and they're going to beat them up. And I'd given instructions. So I ran to the lecture hall where the students were, and I went and stood in front of double doors. Now, these double doors are just normal double doors, as in the studio, in fact. And there's just a clip holding it to one side, and the other side is locked onto the other door. I'm standing in front of these doors, and I'm facing these hundreds coming in, and they're violent. And the whole campus was full of riot police as well. So the riot police came running with their riot gear and their shotguns and their rubber bullets and what have you. And they stood in a semicircle where I was standing. And then these people confronted me and said, there are students in there. And I said, yes. And they said, get out the way. And I said, no. And they said, why not? And photographers from the press. I said, no, it's my responsibility. I said these lectures continue, so if you want to deal with someone, you have to deal with me. And they said, I must get out the way. And I said, no, I won't. And then they start rhythms, and then they just came forward, like vroom, 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 vroom. And they just came. Now, this is hundreds of them, hundreds, and thousands outside, and they're all streaming in, and they pushed me against the door. And such force, you cannot believe it. I could hear my ribs cracking, and you can't breathe. They're going to crush the life out of you. And the door, theoretically, should just snap open. Didn't. It withstood that pressure. And then for no reason they would go back. And I'm looking at the riot police. Hello?
Yeah,
Are you going to help me here?
I was wondering.
Not one finger. They didn't lift a finger. And they came again 7 times. And there was just one man, actually 2 came to help me. The one was a worker, technical worker, and the other one was a lecturer. And they came to help me because they tried to get hold of the fire extinguisher to spray us with fire extinguisher. And so they prevented them from doing that. They held on to the fire extinguishers. But these guys just kept on crushing me 7 times. And I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to die now. And I prayed and I said, well, Lord, help me. Because I've got no one to help me. The riot police are not doing anything. And then all of a sudden the leader said, ah, and they walked out. The whole lot just turned around and they walked out. And they went into the next building and smashed it. They took microscopes and expensive equipment and just threw it out of the buildings and beat up students, but nothing happened to my students.
You were very popular as a result of that, I think.
I was untouchable. Untouchable from then onwards. But it only lasts for a while, right? And so the trials started coming when they had this first case. And I don't know what they'd done, but they had a long list of grievances. And so the university appointed a commission. And this commission had flown in to investigate it. But I didn't know what the grievances were. I didn't know what the situation was. And the one colleague of mine, he was the one who had the list of grievances. Now I'm sitting in my office and the commission is meeting over there. My secretary is opposite me in another office and the other colleagues are around and I'm waiting for this to happen now. And so finally they call him for witness. Comes out, he comes up to my secretary's office, which is just opposite mine, takes a breath, and he falls over. Unconscious. Now this is a young man.
This is the man who opposed you.
Well, they were all, but he had the list.
The list.
Yes. Falls over. There he is. Unconscious. So they call the paramedics come, they rush him out on a stretcher, wheel him out, off into the ambulance, he's gone. So the commission says, well, we've all flown in now, what's going on here? So the only thing is they have the list. So they decide to carry on with the proceedings. So they call me in. And they say, well, this is a grievance. You indoctrinated the students to do this and that, or not to do that, or to believe not this and that and the other. And I said, excuse me, it wasn't like that. And they had witnesses. I said, no, it wasn't like that, it was like this. Well, no, it wasn't like this, it was like that. Now, who's right, right? So I said, well, I have a solution. Why don't you get the whole class? Why call one witness here and one witness there? Get the whole class, and they can tell you whether this is so or whether this is not so. So the whole class was called, and they were to witness then. And I was exonerated. So the whole thing came to nothing. And the next day, he was back at work. They couldn't find anything wrong. But at exactly that moment, here he was, unconscious. And that's quite an experience. Another experience I had while all this was going on is there was another riot. And I was in the Senate building at the time. The Senate had come together. Now that's all the professors and the leaders. And it was a wage dispute, but it had nothing to do with the university. It was a government issue. But as it always is, they take it out on the lowest denominator, so they took it out on the university. So they were surrounding the building, and everybody was thinking, that's it, we're all going to be destroyed here now. This is the end. And they'd surrounded the Senate building, which had very high glass windows. And then I suggested that somebody speak to them as a sort of intermediary, and the lot fell on me. So I went to speak to them, but now I'm coming to them and they're on the other side of the glass, and I'm trying to speak to them through the glass. And I'm telling them, it's not the university's problem. If they have a problem, they must go and riot at the parliament, because it's a parliamentary decision, whatever it was, wages that had been cut or something. But they were violent. The building was completely surrounded. None of us could get out. And then they started rhythmically hitting the windows. Now, you know what it's like when you add rhythm to a building or to a bridge, it can collapse. But this is a strong structure, and they rhythmically started hitting the windows, these big windows. And the next minute, it's like the glass exploded. Just, it came down like rain. And all of a sudden, there was nothing between me and the crowd. Nothing, no protection. And I faced them. And for momentarily, because all this glass came down, they were shocked into silence. And with this, all this crowd came running round to where I was facing these students. Or I don't believe it was students. It was rioters brought in by the busload from outside. And I was facing them. and there was nobody around me except this. And now I'm trying to reason with this person. It's impossible. You cannot reason. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work. But using this opportunity, because everybody was facing me now I'm saying prayers in my head. This is a serious situation. The senators used the back door to get out.
To escape.
They all escaped. Here I'm standing. And then some realized that the senators had all left the building and they tried to prevent it. So they all ran round to the other side of the building to prevent it. And there was nobody in front of me anymore. And I just calmly walked out of there, back to my office. Nothing happened. So I had all these fascinating experiences, and they strengthened me and strengthened my position. Eventually it did get so far that they had another commission and another commission, and it was very unsavory because there were accusations that my students were being intimidated, that some of them had unplugged the refrigerator so that the students' work would go to, be destroyed. And there were accusations against some of my students of impropriety. And the whole thing became very unsavory. And then in the final commission, they decided the complaint was, you cannot be a scientist and believe in God at the same time. You see, what had happened, in the course of all this research that I was doing, it became so big that the Royal Society in London had granted a grant to the university which was given to me. I was the only biologist in the country who got a grant to further reconstruction and development. And this was huge money and huge prestige because it involved the dukes and the Royal Society and the Lords of England and financial liaisons between Cambridge and Oxford and South Africa. And I was right in the middle of this, and I was funded with a lot of money. And this creates tension and jealousy, and in academia these things happen. And so some of these pressures then came to the point where you cannot be a scientist and have this huge quantity of money at your disposal and believe in God at the same time. And the commission eventually decided that that was unconstitutional. Because then you are saying that religious freedom doesn't exist. You're entitled to believe in God. So they actually told me that I can take my university to court for allowing such things, but I didn't want to. So I resigned, but they graciously declined my resignation. But I said I no longer want to be in the zoology department. But my research was so medical at this stage that I just transferred to the medical department. And so for the last few years of my academic career, I didn't have the evolutionary pressure on me.
You wrote a book on health, Diet and Health, Scientific Perspectives. Tell us more about your dairy research.
Yes, well, the dairy research actually started with you, right?
Yes. I remember I told you about
the asthma.
The asthma, and I went home and I started making other kinds of milks, nut milks and soy milks, and I improved within 6 months. I no longer used my pump. I never had asthma after that again, ever. And that actually got him, because he was a little bit behind me in the health thing, because it was difficult for him to make the change over, and the food didn't taste the way he was used to. So it was a bit of a challenge for him. But after he saw the success, with my asthma, he decided he's going to really research this and use it at university level.
And I had a student who was a PhD student, so we started dairy research. And we got in with the medical faculty of another university, and we started a project with vervet monkeys that were very close in their physiology to humans. And we fed some, the normal grain varieties, as a diet, and added dairy to the other, and had a look at what the effect of dairy was. And it was absolutely phenomenal. It was such a huge project that this student actually became a postdoctoral Harvard fellow and went to Harvard. There are only a handful in the world that are chosen for that. And the student actually then proceeded later to become a professor of an alternative medicine faculty that was created. So there's great things that happened out of this research. And the Royal Society was very excited about it. And so I was very involved in dairy research. And I was fascinated that the Spirit of Prophecy wrote and said that it was in the writings that dairy was never part of the original diet, and that eventually it would be excluded. And that cheese was totally unfit for food. So, of course, I then decided that we need projects to prove this, right? And I had so many students, everyone needed a research project, so I'd had them all on these different aspects, and I would say to the students, all right, this is what I want you to do, and then I'd say, I predict that this one will be the best one, and that one will be second best, and that one will be the worst. And the students, of course, were rebellious. Never! Won't be like that. And then when the results came out and the blood parameters were all analyzed, and the hormone levels and all the parameters that go along with health issues, they were stunned, because it was always exactly like that, or combinations of things, and I used all of this information and tested it empirically. And eventually the students started saying, this man is like a prophet. He's telling us ahead of time what the results are going to be, and we don't want the results like that, but they're actually working out like that.
Now, this was the list that you had prepared.
That's the list, yes.
And didn't you systematically go through each item?
I went through each item and planned research on the basis thereof. But you don't have time for everything, right? And I was writing my book. At that stage, I was writing the book, Diet and Health, Scientific Perspectives, and I'd included all of this research. But there was one aspect that intrigued me, and that was that Ellen White writes that the combination milk and sugar is bad for you. And I didn't have time to get a student to write this, to do a research project, because I was busy writing the book, and well, all the places were occupied, and I don't have another year to wait for the next intake. I want the information, and I want it right now. So I did a massive literature search, and in those days, you know, computers were in the beginning. It's not as easy as it is now to do a literature search. It's major work. And I could find nothing. I spent hours and hours, and I had research assistants paging through all the abstracts to see whether there's any research that's been done on this. Nothing, but nothing. And so I'm sitting there in my office, and I'm saying, well, everything that I'm doing is working out exactly like I've read, but I really need this information. So, God, could you help me find something on this? I really need some information on this issue. And the next thing, I'm sitting there and telephone rings. And it's the professor of physiology. And he phones me, and he's a total flap. And he says, you know what, I've just had a problem, because the students are supposed to come to a lecture that I've organized for an outside researcher, but I forgot to tell them. And these students, many of them, of course, run different courses, and quite a few of these students were also in my courses, zoology. And I had the next lecture with the zoology students. So he said to me, can't you do me a favor and cancel your lecture and bring these students, otherwise this man has no audience. And I was upset because I was behind already and I was busy and I had so much to do with these students. But you have to be amiable, so I said, sure, I'll do it. And I was really upset. So when my lecture took place, I went to the students and I said, we're not having this lecture, we're going over to another lecture, so come, all of you. So we went across, so the man had an audience and I was irritated sitting in the back and wasn't really interested in what he was saying. And then he said, I was doing research for a chocolate company, and I was asked to research chocolate as an excellent food because we use it on rescue boats and this, and so they contacted me to show, or to do research to show how excellent and how good chocolate is for you. So the first thing I did was I sat down and I said, well, what does chocolate consist of? Well, there's milk, and there's sugar, and there's cocoa. So the obvious thing is, let's do research on milk and sugar and cocoa and combinations of milk and sugar. Well, a hornet at that stage stung me because I sat upright like a bolt. Here I'd been complaining and saying, oh, what a miserable thing, now I have to go there. Just 2 minutes before that, I'd prayed, I need help. I need something about milk and sugar. See how pathetic we are? Mm. God is in the detail. Yes. He's in the detail. So there he was lecturing. And he was saying what they did is they got groups of students, and then he was still joking because students will do anything for money. Mm-hmm. And he put the one group of students on the equivalent of the milk in a bar of chocolate, which is a glass and a half of milk in chocolate. So they drank the milk, and then they're monitored, and the blood is taken at regular intervals, and you measure the parameters, the cholesterol, the HDL, the LDL, the triglycerides, the whatever. You measure it all. And he says, well, they would all go up, and then they would peak, and then they would come down, and in about 3 hours, it's back to normal, the parameters. And then I'd do it for the sugar, and amazingly, you'd find the triglycerides go up, the cholesterol goes up, which you don't expect for the sugar, and then it levels out after a while. But they're hypoglycemic, so there's a problem there. And then he said, then I did the combination, milk and sugar. He says, it was a disaster. I'll never get funding from a chocolate company again. The parameters shot up more than double than they were originally, but they didn't come down. They stayed there. So you have these increased triglyceride levels and cholesterol levels. And so this combination is very, very harmful. And so I went to him afterwards and I said, when are you publishing this stuff? And he mentioned the journal that it was going to be published in. It was brand new research, not been published yet. And I said, well, that's wonderful. So I incorporated that in my book. So if someone's interested, they can find it there. But this is how God works. And this is how my health research developed.
Did you have any opposition on the dairy issue from outside?
Well, I'm sad to say, not only from the outside, but a fair amount from the inside as well. I remember when I gave my first camp meeting lecture that I lectured on this issue, and by a very fortuitous circumstance, someone very early in the morning gave me the quotes in the Spirit of Prophecy on the issue of dairy. And I was lecturing at this camp meeting, and some of the senior people got up during the lecture and opposed it vehemently. But I had some of the scientific data ready, and I hit them with the scientific data, and I gave them the spirit of prophecy, but it didn't help. It just got worse, the discussion. And then the audience started slow clapping the opponents. So this made it even more uncomfortable. So there was tremendous tension in that camp regarding the health issue. Now, in my country, chicken is considered a vegetable. You have meat for breakfast, and you have meat for lunch, and you have meat for supper. And now you still want to come and touch dairy? I mean, that's considered what? If chicken is a vegetable, then that is untouchable. You're not allowed to go there. But of course, this opposition also came from without, because the dairy industry is a powerful industry. And then the research, of course, with lactose intolerance came into the issue. And black people are highly lactose intolerant. So now you have issues like underfed people. Africa suffers tremendously from malnutrition. And you have thousands of people dying of hunger, and little children with bloated stomachs and thin little legs. You know the horrible pictures in the world. And what's the main food item that they sent these people? Loads and train loads of dairy. These little children are lactose intolerant, and they get diarrhea. So what are you actually doing? You're furthering their demise. You're making it worse. And armed with this information, I had to tell it to the world, because in my opinion it was a travesty of justice. Not because people were willfully mean, but because of pure ignorance. So I went public with my research. And of course, the dairy industry was highly offended. So they flew down the dairy representatives from Pretoria, and they came to see me and confronted me with the issue and threatened to take me to court, to destroy me. And I'd appeared on national television, and I'd done a program on national television, and when I looked at the program, I didn't recognize it, because these people are brilliant. They had so cut what I'd said that any evidence that I'd given, they'd cut out. And they only made me make the statements, you know, where you look like a fanatic, and you're saying this and that and the other. So I looked like a total fanatic on this program, but it had done damage. Enough came through to damage the cause. So when they came down, they threatened me with a court case, and the university, of course, as well, because they were sponsoring my research, and Royal Society was involved in this research. So and these guys are huge. I mean, they're big dairy farmers. Big, highly intimidating. And they sat down and they said what they said, and then I said to them, hold it a second, if you want to take me to court, you're going to have to take the big universities to court too, because this is what is beginning to come out all over the world. And perhaps you don't have all the evidence, because what you saw on television was a fraction of what you should know. So I suggest you first come and sit down and listen. So I took them into the lecture theatre and I gave them a lecture. And I showed them one research project, one slide after the other. When it was finished, they came to me and they said, but it's going to destroy our industry. Can't you please just keep quiet about it? And I said to them, if I keep quiet about it, how will I deal with my conscience? There are thousands of people who are suffering from asthma, bronchial problems, little children who have constant infections, lung infections, ear infections. And then you have this massive contrast between the races and lactose intolerance. Do you want me to be partaker in this? I cannot. My conscience will not allow me. So they sort of begged me to keep quiet and left. And as they left, the one farmer, or the one on the dairy board, who was also a dairy farmer, came running back. And he sat down in my office and he looked at me sort of quietly like this. And then he said, "Is this really all true that you've said?" And I said, "Yes." And this big farmer burst into tears. And he said, "Every single thing that you have mentioned, my little girl has. And she's so sick. So I have been doing the best I can, and this is the result." And I said, "Well, try it. Give her a new lease on life." And he left. So this is emotional research. And wherever I went in the world later, I was tremendously opposed on this issue, not only from outside, but largely from inside as well, from high levels inside. So I always came up against this brick wall. So from then on, my life became one of battering ram. And it's not easy, but truth will have to triumph.
I think every time you touch someone's plate, it becomes personal to them, and it's an emotional link. And people like what they eat. They eat it. They want to take pleasure in it, and so it can be hard to give up these things. Were you the first one that promoted veganism in your country?
I was the first one that promoted veganism in my country. But when I went overseas, I didn't expect quite such a backlash. And in Europe in particular, I mean, some of these medical practitioners, they would bring their own PA systems and shout me down and tell me to go back to my bush where I come from. And I was also talking about prion diseases and other diseases that were coming. And they would shout, prion disease, who's ever heard of prion disease, go back to your bush. And then, of course, 4 years later, all of this actually hit the world.
Yeah.
And these issues, antibiotic resistance, the dairy issue, this all became public knowledge. And today we have massive industries, soya milk industries, alternative milk products. It didn't exist. It didn't exist at that time. So without being presumptuous, I can say that I'm grateful to God that at least I played a part in that awakening, so that people today have a choice, whereas then the choice was so limited.
Yeah.
There were people preaching it, there were people trying to introduce it, and the methodologies were there, but the push and the emphasis, that had not yet come.
And that God used you with your research. That's what needed to happen to get this out a little more prominently so that people can start having choices.
I can see the bumps on my head, but I think the fruits were good, and I'm grateful to God.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to take a break again, and we'll be back in another episode to hear further about your life experiences. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. We're in the studio again with Walter and Sonika Veit. And we've just been hearing about your research on dairy and on protein and how that all transpired. Now, we haven't heard about how you started moving internationally. This was all in South Africa up until this point. How did you get into preaching and presenting in other countries?
Well, I was preaching quite regularly in South African churches, and there was one church in particular that had been started, which was a German church. And since I'm capable of speaking some German, being from a German background, I preached there sometime. And then one of your relatives from Germany, your uncle,
Yes,
he came to South Africa, and of course, being German, he went to the German church, and there he heard me preaching once or twice, and he also came to visit us, and then he invited me to come to Germany. But that's quite an interesting story. At that stage, we were driving around in a clapped-out vehicle that took some beholding, because we had all these financial turmoils. We were so heavily mortgaged because of the farm issue still. We didn't have money to buy a car. And of course, I had to have a car to get to work and back. So what I'd done is I bought a scrap car off a scrap heap that had a totally trashed body. It was totally falling apart, but the engine was still relatively okay. And I bought that for next to nothing. But I couldn't drive with it because the body was totally trashed. And then I found another one, the same type. It was an old Audi that had no engine whatsoever, but the body was fine. No transmission, no engine, no nothing. And so Sonika and I proceeded out of two vehicles to make one. And so she and I...
That was quite a thing, because I had to transfer parts from the one to the other, and my fingers were actually bleeding from trying to get the stuff screwed in. And
I had no idea how to build a car, but we
built a car.
And so we drove around in this thing. It was smoking like crazy. I don't think it was too roadworthy, but they did get it through. And Stan looked at this thing and thought, this is impossible. Anyway, he leant back to Germany, and in the meantime, we were trying to get a vehicle that, might just be better for us. But we couldn't afford a vehicle. And I don't know whether you have them here, but they have these car auctions where you can bid on a vehicle. And we found at one of these car auctions quite a nice pickup, but it looked too nice. I didn't think we would be able to afford it. And while we were looking at the vehicle, two people came up to us and said to us, the highest bid on that vehicle is, and I can't remember how much it was.
I don't remember.
Whatever. I still looked at them and I said, these people are off the wall, because the next bidding is when that thing is opened, that box where you throw your bid in, and that's only in 2 weeks' time. So how would they know what the highest bid is, right? It's a stupid thing to say. How do they know what the highest bid is going to be? There's another 2 weeks of bidding. But it intrigued me, and so I said to my wife, let's bid 100 Rand more today. That's $10 more. Mm-hmm. So I bid $10 more, put it in there. And we laughed because it was such a ridiculous amount, it was going to be impossible. And 2 weeks later, I went back and they unlocked that thing and they took out all the things and packed them out, and they were putting them in categories, and they were saying, this is the bid, this is the bid. And then the highest bid was mine, and it was 100 Rand, those $10 more than the other bid. And I said, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. How could that person have known what the next bid is going to be when there's still this time for bidding? And so the auctioneers, they looked at the bid and they rejected the bid. They rejected it. They said, no, it's too low. It's way below the baseline that they had. And I hung around until everyone was gone, and I said, so you rejected that one? I said, that's my bid. Yes, no, you'll have to double that. I said, how do you know? Why don't you phone the people who have the minimum payment? He says, no, it's the bank. We know them. They won't take it. It's a repossessed vehicle. They won't take that bid. I said, how do you know? Why don't you phone them? And they said, no, you're wasting my time. I said, well, phone them. And they phoned. And lo and behold, the bank said, give it in. So we got that vehicle at that price, and we were overjoyed, had the old vehicle standing there. And then we had to go to Germany. And then they said to us, probably not understanding our financial position, could you pay the aeroplane ticket and you'll be reimbursed when you get to Europe? Now what? We didn't have money to buy an aeroplane ticket, and we had no assets. But we thought we'll make a plan somehow and work it out. I didn't want to tell them I don't have money to buy an aeroplane ticket. After all, I'm German and I have my pride too. And then she had a teacher's loan, which I had never paid. And at some stage we were being, this is years before, we were being sued for this teacher's loan. And so I sent them a ridiculous amount and they accepted it. And now legally, when they accept that, you can keep on paying that ridiculous amount. It was something like 20 Rand, which is $2 a month that we sent to them. And now all of a sudden they'd got their ducks in a row and they sued us. We had to pay that loan immediately or face the consequences. So now we were in big trouble. What was I going to do? No money, this loan over my head, aeroplane ticket. The only asset we now had is that vehicle that we just bought. And it was very painful. We prayed about it. We worked out how much is the airplane ticket, how much is the loan that we have to repay. Okay, that's so much. We put the vehicle in the market for that much, and within 1 hour it was gone. So I paid her loan, that was paid the airplane tickets, but now I had a crisis. Because in the university recess I was to go to Europe, and where do I get money to give her when I leave now? Because I'd spent my salary in advance already. So what am I going to do now? Am I going to go away for a month and my family is without food? So we wrestled with that, and then we got a phone call from someone who didn't know us, from a bar of soap. Where was Wish from?
From at least 4 hours drive from us.
Yes.
Somewhere in the middle of the Karoo.
And this person said to us, are you Walter Fight? And I said, yes. And this person said, well, I had a dream. And I said, what dream did you have? She says, I had a dream I must give you something. And I'm sending my son who works in the Cape, he's going to come and he's going to give you something. I said, what did you dream? She says, no, I just dreamt that I have to give you something and I'm going to give that to you now. So I said, well, thank you very much, whatever. And then this young man arrived and he gave us an envelope. And in it was enough money to take care of the family for that month. So somebody had a dream in the middle of nowhere, and that solved that problem. But the only other problem was now I didn't have a vehicle anymore. It had been sold. So all this thing with the vehicle was to make enough profit that I didn't have to go and beg anyone for solving my crisis. So God solved those crises for me. Then I got to Germany, and lo and behold, I met with very exciting events. One of the first colleges I went to was one of our own colleges, and I was to lecture on evolution and creation, because I had a whole lecture series on that by then, of course. And the students sat in the college, and I was about to start. I was introduced, and the class representative student got up and said, "Excuse me, are you going to speak on behalf of evolution or against evolution?" Now this is an Adventist institution, right? I look at him as though he's fallen off a bus, and I say, "I'm going to speak on behalf of creation." He says, "Well, neither I nor any of us are going to listen to such rubbish. We are not interested in your stupid speculations. We believe in evolution." And the whole class walked out.
Wow.
They just walked out. That was my first experience with the Europeans. Okay. But now they were sniggering. There were about 4 or 5 that were embarrassed and sort of stuck to their chairs and still were inside the hall, and the others were out in the hall, in a hallway, and out in the foyer and wherever. And I was feisty in those days. So I opened the windows and I opened the doors, and I said to the 4 or 5, and I started speaking at the window. So I was actually talking to these outside, and this ringleader was going crazy. And then I said, "You know, there are people that are so cowardly that they're not willing to listen to the evidence. They make up their mind before they listen to the evidence. And people that are of that nature are either brain dead or spiritually blind." And then I said, "Here's the evidence. And by the way, you cowards out there, here it is." And I put it on the screen. And every time I had a slide on the screen, I say, "You cowards, look here, look here." And didn't go too well. But the next day, second lecture, place was packed. They were all back.
So, Walter, you were pretty obnoxious to those students who didn't want to hear your lectures, shouting at them like that through the window. What do you think about how you handled that?
Well, you see, I believe God uses you where you are. And He doesn't wait until you're perfect, now you can go. He uses you when you are willing to go.
I agree.
So at that stage, I probably felt God needed a little bit of assistance. So I gave it in my particular way.
In your own particular fashion?
But today I would probably think he's quite capable of handling it himself, and I would have probably not done it that way. Hopefully, at least. So we did our lectures there in that way, and then I also lectured on the health issue. So I started writing my book, and that created a furor, and I had opposition from the medical people. And there was one person there, he was so obnoxious. And he was sitting next to a lady, and he was interrupting me all the time and saying that I was backward and should go back to my trees and whatever. But I was busy writing a book on the issue. I had the scientific publications, and of course, being Germany, they think German is everything. There are no other languages, and nobody is as scientifically and technologically advanced as they are, or some of them think that way. And so I started quoting in some of the magazines, and I actually had, because I was still writing some portions, some of the publications with me. And I started getting a little bit sarcastic with him, because he would refute something, and I say, well, this is the German journal Nature. This is the best journal in the world. And here's the journal Science. That's the equivalent in the United States. And here's the journal Lancet. But you don't understand English, so I don't think you understand this modern stuff, do you? I was getting a little bit shirty. So he got annoyed. And he started getting quite vindictive. And I looked at him like this, and I said, you know why you're giving me so much opposition? Is because you have such a bad diet. And I can see it in your face. Look at the veins on your face. You're all red. The blood is going through your skins because your arteries are clogged. That's why you can't think properly. And that did it. He exploded. And then to crown it all, I said to him, if you look around you, if you look at the lady next to you, she has a much nicer complexion than you have. Perhaps you should ask her what to eat.
You weren't very tactful.
No, but he annoyed me. He really riled me. So he threw his toys out of his cot and he left. He stomped out. I felt a little bit bad having been so forthright, but I finished my lecture without interruptions. Maybe nobody dared after that, I don't know. And after the lecture, I was packing my things and I was thinking, that was quite embarrassing. And this lady came up to me, the one that sat next to him, and she said to me, that was my husband.
Uh-oh.
I thought I was going to die. I didn't know it was the husband. And then she said to me, and thank you for doing that. I've been trying to live healthily in my home, and he makes my life hell. This is the first time someone's put him in his place. Thank you so much. So that was one of the first experiences in Germany. And we went to many places and lectured, and it went actually quite well. And we rolled back some of the opposition. The health issue didn't always go down so well, but some of our colleges then started forming groups, and the health message actually started getting a foothold. And the next thing, when we were finished with this German tour, at the airport, your uncle says to me, when he was in South Africa, he saw what a horrendous vehicle I was driving. Do I still drive that vehicle? So I said to him, well, it's the only one I had left. I just sold the other one. I didn't tell him that. I said, yes. He said, well, that's not a fit thing to drive. You can't drive with a thing like that. And he says, we as a group, and it's lots of people, not just me, we all contributed something, and here's an envelope for you, and there's a little note in it, and you may only open it when you get home. And don't think it's from me. It's not from me, it's from many people, so it's no big deal for us, but it'll help you. So I felt a bit bad taking that, but I said thank you, came home, opened it, and in it was money and a letter which says, with this money you may only buy for yourself a new car. But it must be a new car. It says you must buy yourself a new car. Now, new car can be interpreted new car, or it can be interpreted another car. But I interpreted it new car, but you couldn't buy a new car for what was in it. Because we have very expensive cars. Our cars are highly taxed, much more expensive than in Europe or in America, much more expensive. And you couldn't even buy the dinkiest little thing new. You couldn't even buy Uno new. You'd have to almost double it, so forget it. You can't buy a new car. So I said to my wife, I don't think you can buy a new car with this. And we looked, there's no car that you could buy for it. So we decided that it must mean a newish car.
Something new to you.
Something new to me.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we went and had a look for another vehicle. And we went from dealer to try and buy something that's reasonable for that price. But it kept bothering me that it said new car. And then we were about ready to buy a second-hand car for a reasonable price, when the dealer said, but why don't you buy a new car? I said, no, I can't afford a new car. And in any case, they're too expensive. I don't have enough money. He says, well, take a loan. He didn't understand, you see. I was loaned up to the hilt. I said, no, I can't take a loan. So then he said, well, we have a vehicle. There are another 3 left in the country, I think. And it's a Volkswagen Jetta, and there it is. I said, no, forget it. I can't afford a Volkswagen Jetta. That's way too expensive. He says, no, but the new model has come out, and there are still 3 of the old model, and they've been marked down. They're almost half price. They're just a little more than half price. So I said, that's interesting. And he said, we have one. And I think there's one there or one there. So I looked at it, and it was too much. I couldn't afford it. Couldn't buy half a Jetta. So I said, no, it's too expensive for me. I can't do it. So he said, that's ridiculous. This car is half price. It's cheaper than these second-hand cars. You would be an idiot if you didn't take this car. I said, yes, I know, but I can't do it because I couldn't take any more loans. And so he said, okay, that's sad. And so his boss came out and said, where do you work? I said, I work at the university. He says, but the university qualifies for fleet discount. So the salesman said, yes, but this car is marked down, so they won't give fleet discount on it. So he said, phone the factory. So he phoned Volkswagen factory, which is in Port Elizabeth, and says, we have a man here who works for the university, he qualifies for fleet discount, but this is a marked down car, but it's a new car because you only get it on new cars. And they agreed that I could get fleet discount. And guess what? To the cent, with licensing, that vehicle was exactly what was in the envelope. And that just made me think. Because what did it take? It took getting a new car almost, well, I believe, miraculously, getting a new car and then having to sell it. Mm-hmm. Why? Because I was going to go do evangelism overseas. That was the reason. I had to buy an airplane ticket, which was reimbursed, but nevertheless, it was like little Isaac that you were willing to sacrifice, and God gave it back. And that vehicle lasted miraculously, didn't it?
The tires, remember?
The tires, I did over 180,000 kilometers on one set of tires.
Wow.
That's impossible. You get 40, 50,000 on a set of tires. They just wouldn't wear out. They were like the shoes of the Israelites. And the mileage that we did with it was all evangelistic mileage. So God takes care of all those little details.
Mm-hmm.
And it encouraged us to constantly think, like the text says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. And this was our motto from then on. We would constantly first do what we have to do and what we would like to do for the Lord, and everything else followed.
Yes, I had to gain a lot of experience. I had to understand prophecy. I had to understand history. I had to understand archaeology. This is all part of my lecture series. So during one vacation, somebody sponsored a trip to the Middle East, a Bible trip, which I did with Francois Duplessis. And we went through Israel and all the places. I took all the pictures that I needed for my evangelistic series that were coming up. Amongst other things, we went to Turkey to do the 7 churches, which later became one of my lecture series. And there was a Muslim tour guide who took us to the 7 churches. So we rented a bus, the whole group, and we went on this tour. And Francois Duplessis he always has an evangelistic mindset. And so he made sure that I would sit always next to the tour guide. And the tour guide would say what is happening there in this city, in Ephesus and Smyrna and Laodicea. And as the tour guide was explaining, or as she was explaining, then I would explain the other side of the story. And she became so intrigued with this that by the end, she was like one of us. And we left for South Africa. Francois even said to her, we go to church on a Sabbath. Could she arrange that the bus takes us to church on that day? So we went to church and she attended. And then we went back to South Africa, and a little while later we got a call. She would like to find out more. So this Muslim lady with her daughter came out to South Africa. We enrolled her for a course in Helderberg, but she had no vehicle. And so this old one that we had, we gave her this vehicle. And we asked her, can you drive? Have you got a license? She said, yes, absolutely. So she got into this car, we gave her the keys, she started this thing off, and she roared off as though she was taking off. What did she do? She drove straight over the pavement.
Over the pavement, almost through the garbage cans, and off at a speed.
Boom, she was gone. In any case, she would regularly modify the vehicle. She would drive through dirt cans, she would back up into walls or miss a turn and take away the side. And then she would come to us and she would cry, oh, I made an accident with your car. And we said, don't worry, it's an old car, just carry on. And then through the dirt bins. It was so funny. And she had Bible studies with us and with Francois. And by the end, she was convicted and wanted to become a Christian, a Seventh-day Adventist, but she was afraid of being murdered when she returned, because that's what often happens to someone who converts. And later she emigrated to America, and she married an Adventist pastor. And she translated many of the writings and works in those areas to this day. So there was an interesting experience with some of these trips. But then the next one was that you came to South Africa.
Yeah, we did.
You must tell what happened
1992.
there. Well, what happened then?
Well, we went to South Africa for a visit with my uncle, just to see the countryside, and there we met you. He introduced you to us, and we were thinking, this would be a great speaker for North America, and so we planned with you a series in 1993 in the Massey Theatre at New Westminster.
Yes.
And that was quite an experience. For us, our first evangelistic series, we were just laymen, we didn't know what we were doing. And God filled that hall to the last seat.
Yes, now, that was my first real public evangelistic campaign. I mean, I'd done lectures in Europe, but they were largely in a church setting. Here was a public campaign in a foreign country for me, my first, and it was the Massey Theatre, and my message was quite controversial because I would deal with the papacy. Now, you must understand why the papacy was so important to me and why the connections with the occult world were so important to me. Because remember, I'd come from that world. And I'd had so many experiences with my father-in-law, and I knew that the occult world was not some airy-fairy thing that was happening somewhere, but that it was real, that it was involved in politics and also masonry. I started giving lectures on the secret connections and the secret societies. And as I lectured in South Africa, I had many, many experiences. Sometimes it happened that in the middle of the night, knock on the door, and here stands a person, and he was very agitated, and came in, and he said, I'm a high Freemason, and I've listened to your lectures, and I know that what you are saying is the truth on these issues, but you need a little more information. And there are books that you don't have access to, that I have access to, and I've brought you one. But if they find out that I took this book out and gave it to a non-initiated person, I will die. So you have this book until 4 o'clock tomorrow morning. Then I will come and fetch it and see that it's back in the lodge before anybody knows that it was gone. I said, all right. Now, what do I do with it? I can't read a book this thick between 12 o'clock and 4 o'clock. So what am I going to do? So I had some of those film rolls and this little black bag in that day, and roll up a film, put it in the camera, and I photographed as many of the pages of the book as I could with the titles. And by 4 o'clock, I had virtually done most of it, but I was also run out of film. And he came to fetch it, and it was gone, and then I could start studying that. I'd also had an experience in Europe, in Germany, where after one of my lectures where I touched upon this issue, I was one of the last to walk out, or the last, because you have to, you pack up your slides, and those days it wasn't as simple as today. You had all of these slides, and you have to pack them into their right sequence. And as I left the hall, I was walking down the passage, and the lights were going out, when a hand came out of what seemed like a closet, grabbed me from behind and pulled me into the closet. And I thought my last moment had come. And the man said to me, if you see my face, then that will be your end. So you will not turn round, you will not look at me, you will leave this closet, you will walk out, and tomorrow I will do the same to you, and you will not know who it was, and I will give you something. So life was getting to be interesting. And the next day I gave my lecture, and I'm thinking, what's going to happen to me? And I walk out after that lecture, and I go past the closet, nothing happens, and I go past some foyer thing, and here I am. And he gives me a pile of books. And he says, now go. You don't know who it is. And I will fax you something. I need your number. So I gave him a fax number. And he says, you promise that when you get the fax, you cut the top off and you burn it, so that there's no sendee. I said, I promise. And I left. And this is how information started coming, one after the other. And I had so many connections. My biggest problem was always connecting the papacy, the secret societies, the Jesuits. How are they all connected? Because I knew they had to be connected, because Revelation chapter 13 had said so. And the spirit of prophecy was very clear that if you study if you study the book of Revelation, then you will know to stay clear of secret societies. And she mentions Freemasonry by name, so I knew there were connections. And I had some of the occult writings from my father-in-law, and I was studying all this stuff and putting it together. So my lectures were different from other people. They had these occult connections. And if Revelation chapter 13 says that the beast out of the sea will be the one who will be paid homage to and will control the world, and that it's spirits of demons that are doing this work, well, then this stuff is all interconnected, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was starting putting these things together, and when I got to the Massey, my first ever public campaign, this was going to be a big deal. I'd been on public campaigns, but with Francois Duplessis, I was always the sidekick. Here was something I had to do by myself, and then in a foreign land. And letters had preceded me, warning certain people that I should not talk on issues of health or something of that nature, or this or that or the other. And someone had intercepted the letter and made a copy and given it to me, so I knew it in advance. I was in trouble in a foreign land. Already I was being stabbed in the back, as it were. Get to Massey Theatre, and it seats 1,260 people.
Prophetic number.
That was weird to begin with. Now, the organizers had said that you'll never fill this hall, not with something like that. And it was cold and it was wet and it had snowed a little bit and there was some ice and it had melted again. Nobody thought it was going to be full, but it was packed. And the organizers said, no more people. If it gets any fuller, then we'll have to close it. This is fire regulations. And it was packed. And we did double sessions. So you did a lecture, you had a 20 or 30-minute break, you did another lecture.
Yeah.
Now, the only people I had contact with was the AD team. And they were in the back of the hall, and I was on the stage in the front of the hall. And I had all of these slides. And there were so many people there. And while I was starting lecturing, your city sent out tow trucks to remove the illegally parked vehicles, so everybody ran out of the hall and then to go and see whether their vehicle is being removed. But your dad went and sorted it out and went and stood in front of the trucks, and I got to know him a little bit better. He's a feisty person. He won't let himself be intimidated very readily. And so we gave these lectures. Now, there was one interesting thing. There were rows in the Massey. There were side doors and back doors. And the Massey Theatre was packed, but there was one seat that was open. Just one. And there was always the seat in the front in the first block. And that was always open. Now, why would that always be open? That's weird, because anybody can sit anywhere. There were no seat assignment. And halfway through my first lecture, the side door would open, which normally would not open during a lecture. And this little fellow with Down syndrome came in. And he would walk up and down the front there, and he was very stocky, short, and his tongue hung out. And he sang. He sort of, yeah. He wasn't a nuisance. He was just there. Then he used to sit down in that chair. And I gave the whole lecture. And then everybody would go. And then I started getting into the serious topics, talking about the Antichrist, giving these Bible lectures, bringing in some of this newer information. And there was a crowd there that got very angry. At one stage, they actually ran on the stage and shouted that I am the Antichrist and that the people should get out and not listen to me. And they were very irate and very aggressive. And in between the break, they would corner me and they would be aggressive, and some of them actually wanted to hit me. And there was no one to help me because the AD team was in the back, I was in the front, there was an audience between them and me, mingling, getting up, stretching their legs in this aggressive crowd. And I tried to appease them, but it got worse and worse. And then this little guy with Down syndrome, he used to get up and he'd take his short, stocky little arms and he'd work his way through the crowd. And then he'd come and stand next to me and he'd put his arm around me and he'd put his head on my shoulder here, on my side. He only came up to here. And then he'd look at them and he'd sing with his little la la, la la la. Now, if there's anything that's disarming, it's someone with a little Down syndrome boy stuck to him. There's no way you're going to hit someone who has a Down syndrome boy stuck to him. And so the time would come for the next session and I'd go back up onto the stage, he would go and sit down. And the next day the same thing. Now I got very dependent upon him. And sometimes, because he always came in sometime during the first lecture, he wasn't there from the beginning. Sometimes he didn't pitch. So I actually stretched my lecture to see is he going to come. I was totally dependent upon him. And then he'd come, and then I'd relax and finish the lecture and go down and face these aggressive ones, and the Downs boy would help me. And then we moved the lectures to, I don't remember where.
It was across the river to another municipality.
But it was far away.
Yeah.
Now, I always thought, the Down syndrome boy was part of the furniture. He was always alone. He didn't have any parental care. There was no peer with him, nobody to take care of him. So I thought, well, maybe he's a neighbor's kid, or maybe he belongs to the caretaker of the hall, and he's part of the establishment. So that's it, and I won't see him again. And then I finished the entire campaign, and then the very last day, the AD team was very mean to me. They gave me a whole host of lectures, I don't know, 5 or 6 in a day. And I was exhausted, and the next day I had to fly back. And I went through that entire day, and I had all my slides in trays. So I'd give the first lecture, and then there would be this tray of lecture, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and they were all piled in the back there. And now after the lectures, of course, I have to sort them back into their little packages so that I can carry them in my hand luggage. And in the last lecture, I'm still busy with the last lecture, the door opens and the Down syndrome boy comes walking down. Now you could have knocked me over with a feather, because what was he doing there? This is now a different part of the city. He couldn't have been part of the establishment, couldn't have belonged to the hall, couldn't have been part of the team, couldn't have been a neighbor. And he's too Downs to have traveled by himself. What's he doing there? And he sat down in the same spot relative to the other spot. There in the front, there was a seat open, and he sat there. And when the lectures were finished, the people went out into the foyer, and only he remained behind, and me. So I have no witnesses. People will just have to accept my word for it. Now I'm standing in the front at the pulpit, resorting my slide back into their little zip packages so that it's a nice small packet. And I've got 6 lectures to pack back, and it's going to clickety-clackety, clickety-clack. And I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me. And he gets up, and he sings, and he walks back and forth, and then he goes round and up the stage, and he comes and stands next to me, puts his arms around me, and puts his head there, just like he used to. Now it's quite awkward. There's nobody attacking me. I'm all alone. He's stuck here. I'm talking to him and sorting my slides at the same time and looking at him. And I'm wondering, how did he get here? And who is this? And the thought comes to me, this is too unusual. And I pluck up the courage, because I didn't really have the courage to do that, but I grab him by the shoulders and I push him away from me and I push him in front of me. And I say to him, I have one question for you. Are you a human being or are you an angel? And he took a step back and he did that. And he looked up and he walked out. And that to me was a groundbreaking experience. Mm-hmm. Because it's not by might and it's not by power, but by my Down syndrome boy. You don't have to have one big hunk of a person to come and protect you. God has 1,000 ways in which to protect you. And so when this boy did that, I was very grateful. And I've been in positions that were similar or worse. And I've never had any fear, not because I'm not human, but because I have absolute faith that He's there. And He's not small. And He doesn't have downs.
No.
One stroke and everybody would be dead before Him. Mm-hmm. And I was in Slovenia. And I did a series there. And they wanted to stop the series. So the Orthodox Church there has its own protectors, almost like a militia, own police force. And this militiaman, this ringleader, came onto the stage and he shoved me harshly, brutally aside, grabbed the mic out of my hand, shoved my little translator, who was a tiny little lady, her aside violently, and I got annoyed with him, so he tried to shove me again, and I stood my ground. He ripped the mic out of my hand and he commanded everyone to leave the hall. And the people got up. I don't know, there was about, I don't know how many, 800 people. They got up like one man and came forward and said, "You get up, because we came to listen to what he has to say and you're not going to tell us what to do." So he saw that he was going to be in trouble now, so he said, "I'll be back and we will come and beat you up." So he ran out of the hall and someone called the police and there was quite a turmoil. And then the police arrived with over 200 policemen. And the chief of police and the whole lot were there. And the policemen surrounded the hall. And then the chief of police and his officers sat in the front row. And from then on they attended the entire series, all the lectures. And that militia did come back. And the police warned them that if they interfere with these lectures, they will be arrested and they won't have a trial for 6 months. They will be in jail. So they better leave. Don't know what law he quoted. And that solved the problem. So I think my audience wasn't big enough. I needed a bigger audience. So the police force was summoned.
Had to join, yeah.
And my little Down syndrome angel was there. It was interesting, when I came into the country, they interrogated me at the airport because I had everything in their writing and I didn't understand the writing because it was like Russian writing and I didn't know what it meant. So they kept asking me where I was going and who I was going to see, and I said, I don't know. And this person, he was quite obnoxious and he was pointing his rifle at me, and why wasn't I telling him what it was? And I said, I have it in writing, you can read it. He wasn't interested. I had to tell him. And I went through this for a long time. They wouldn't let me through the airport. And finally, I don't know, I must have gone insane or something. I just got up and I took hold of him this policeman or this border guard or whatever with his machine gun. I grabbed him by the shoulder and I said, you know what? You're asking me all these questions, you're asking the wrong person. The person who's coming to fetch me is the person who'll tell you what his name is and where I'm staying. So you and I, we're going to the airport, to the other side, where they will come and fetch me. And I just took him and I started walking. He was so flabbergasted, he came along. And we went right through security, right past everything, into the reception hall. And I said, now you stand there and you wait. Because I didn't know who was going to come and fetch me. And the next minute, this person comes up and says, are you Walter Veit? I said, yes, thank you. Here, ask your questions. That's how I got into the country. The other thing that was interesting, I can't remember whether it was that country or another country, but they got so interested, they wanted to put me on the radio. And at that stage, this massive radio station that the Russians had used in the time of the Cold War to scramble signals. So it was one of the most powerful radio stations in that area. I think they called it Novosibirsk. Yeah. That's right. And for some strange reasons, Adventists were given access to that media. And they interviewed me for hours on that, and it was broadcast to millions of people with translation. So doors just opened. It was unbelievable. Never underestimate how God works behind the scenes.
No, and He has 1,000 ways to solve the problems we face.
That's right.
Whether it is a Down syndrome boy or a police force or whatever, He will find a way. Well, we're going to take another break, and we thank you for joining us again. And yes, we will come back again for the rest of the story.